Earlier today, the Bengals cut veteran defensive tackle Sheldon Rankins, moving on from him after just 1 year in Cincinnati. Now, there's a lot of question marks about the Bengals offseason. This was not one of them. This is a move that we've talked about since the in-season and one we've just kind of been waiting on since the season came to an end. Sheldon Rankins officially no longer a Bengal, and the Bengals will be saving $9.6 million in cap space. So a significant move to move off the veteran defensive tackle this early in the offseason.
Yeah, look, they brought Sheldon Rankins in to be able to provide some pass rush up the middle, and unfortunately just never really happened for him.
Yeah.
At least from a PFF perspective, no single game with a grade over 65.7, more games in 50 than not. At the end of the day, he ends up with, I think, 8 total tackles and 1 sack on the season. Certainly not enough to justify the spend that they had. Look, he missed a big portion of the season with illness that we don't have a lot of information on, and certainly wish him the best on that. But as I thought about this, Jacob, and as I looked at the Bengals offseason, more than cutting Sam Hubbard, more than cutting Alex Kappa, more than extending T, more than extending Trey, maybe even more than extending Jamar, this was the most obvious move that I actually felt like the Bengals would make this offseason out of all of them.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. The number makes it that obvious. The $9.6 million on the books for a guy who didn't play this year, and when he did play, he wasn't great. We brought him in to be the pass rush up the middle, something that Cincinnati hasn't had in quite some time, really since the one season of Larry Ogunjobi when we had a consistent pass rush up the middle. Brought Sheldon Rankins in to try to be that guy. He ravaged the Bengals last year, absolutely dominated them, 4 sacks when he was on the Texans and they visited Paul Brown Stadium, Paycor Stadium, and the Bengals saw that and they wanted to bring him in. Obviously didn't find the same level of success in Cincinnati. I've already seen a lot of people bringing it up, and it's obviously the first question I thought of. He was the DJ Reader replacement. How much better of a place would this team be in if they would have spent that same money to just keep DJ Reader around rather than spend it on 1 year of Sheldon Rankins?
Well, I mean, hindsight's 2020, right?
Right.
I mean, there's a lot of conversations. We have the same exact conversation about Jesse Bates, right?
Yep.
I mean, DJ Reader went out. He got his $11 million a year contract. Very similar contract to what they ended up giving to Sheldon Rankins.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, they weren't able to come together. The Bengals didn't view DJ Reader on that same level, and, so be it. But the truth of the matter is that yet again, they whiffed on a free agency signing, and now they are left with basically 2 defensive tackles on the roster for 2025, and that's in second-year players Chris Jenkins and McKinley Jackson. Everybody else is either up for contract or now gone. So defensive tackle remains, if not leaps into the number one need for this team in this offseason. And whether that's through free agency or the draft or both, the Bengals are going to have to figure this piece out because they've had way, way too many misses on the interior side of the defensive line for sure.
Not just is the Bengals' interior defensive line not good enough, but you said it there, just 2 guys still staying here. B.J. Hill, a pending free agent, just obviously letting go of Sheldon Rankins. They need bodies. They can't run out there with these 2 guys. They can't enter the draft needing this many bodies and the interior defensive line. So they have to address it in free agency to give them that wiggle room when the draft does roll around that, hey, we don't have to, tie an arm behind our back and draft a defensive tackle here if he's not the best player on the board. This team has a lot of holes. This roster is far from perfect. I would hate for the Bengals to go into the draft with a need of a specific position from a bodies perspective. You got to leave the door open there to take the best player available, and that's kind of what worries me with the current state of that D-line room.
Yeah, one of the things that was going to be interesting for me this offseason is, are there guys currently on the roster, and I'm specifically thinking of Sam Hubbard and Myles Murphy, that makes sense to try and move them inside? We already know that they have not been as successful on the edge as maybe the Bengals had hoped. We saw Lou Anarumo move Myles Murphy around on the line throughout the season, especially towards the end, and try him out at different positions, creating different matchups. And I felt like he actually had more success on the inside going up against the guards than he did when he was on the outside going up against tackles. So guys like Myles Murphy, guys like Sam Hubbard who have lost a step, doesn't make sense.
Yep.
Restructure Sam Hubbard's contract, bring him back as a depth piece on the inside, bulk him up a little bit along with Myles Murphy, and maybe those guys add some depth to your interior part of your line, and then you supplement that through the draft or through a free agency signing or two. But I wouldn't be shocked to see them restructure that Sam Hubbard contract and then see if he can't make something work inside. Myles Murphy, we already saw them try that at the end of last year, showed some promise. Will he bulk up this offseason and maybe make that transition inside as well?
We've thrown Sam Hubbard in that cut pile with Sheldon Rankins and many others through the most of the season and into the offseason. Now without Sheldon Rankins and really looking at this defensive line and the roster construction we have left, I'm starting to think a restructure for Sam Hubbard could start to make a little bit more sense. You have Joseph Ossai, who's a spending free agent as well. B.J. Hill, we already talked about on his way out. Obviously, the Trey Hendrickson discussion is one that's loud and prevalent this offseason, but keeping a guy like Sam Hubbard around, if you do want to move him inside, obviously at a significant pay cut, but restructuring that contract to keep him around might be more intriguing to the Bengals now than it was even just a few weeks ago, especially with even moving off the defensive line to Jermaine Pratt, your multi-year captain at linebacker, leaving the locker room. That's a leadership role, at least that's what he's played up to be, and Sam Hubbard losing both those guys, two captains in the same year, that could be tough for a defense with a new defensive coordinator. So as we progress through this offseason, I think a lot of these moves go together with other moves the Bengals are going to make. So we'll see what happens as this ripples through the rest of the cuts. But I think this is just the start. The boulders at the top of the hill, they're pushing it down, and it's about to pick up steam. We know Jermaine Pratt already requested the trade a few weeks ago, and we've talked about many other guys that the Bengals seem to be no-brainer cuts as we near the offseason. The tag deadline for T. Higgins coming up in about a week. Everything's about to get rolling here pretty quickly for this Bengals offseason, and as Craig said, this is the most no-brainer move of all of them, and I think that's why it happened first. There really wasn't much discussion to be had about Sheldon Rankins. There was no way to keep him around, and I think now that you have that money aside and we have an idea, as we found out yesterday, about what the cap's going to end up being this year, you start making those moves, figuring out where you're going to spend that extra money, because the Bengals are going to end up having a lot of money if they cut the guys we expect them to cut, and even if they don't, they're going to have a lot of money to work with, about $60 million. So that's very exciting as we move into this offseason with the holes we have. But I think the Bengals need to be willing to take risks. That's my biggest worry about the cut of Sheldon Rankins, and really with the play of Geno Stone last year. Those were the two big free agency signings for the Bengals. Neither of them worked, at least not in year one, and now we know Sheldon Rankins didn't work at all, and we're all holding out a little bit of hope that maybe Geno Stone can come into the form we saw in Baltimore, but if those don't work, the Bengals becoming risk-averse in free agency when we already know they're risk-averse in the draft, that'd be a scary place to be when you're trying to build a roster with a lot of holes in it around a very expensive quarterback and potentially two very expensive wide receivers.
Well, it goes to part of the conversation around how do you find that stability, right?
Yeah.
So it just gives you even more reason to maybe make someone like Sam Hubbard make sense on a restructured contract. You're talking about all these changes that are bound to happen, and we've already talked about many of them throughout Chatterbox Bengals throughout the entire year. Obviously, there are four big names at the top of the list that we are expecting or hoping the Bengals to work out contracts with potentially a restructure with Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase extension, Trey Hendrickson, and of course T. Higgins. But there are multiple names in that same realm that either could be restructured or released. And Sam Hubbard is the next one on that list at $11.5 million cap hit in 2025 as of right now. That's got to be reduced. Alex Kappa, 10.2. That's got to be reduced or removed. You already mentioned Jermaine Pratt asking for his release or trade. So there's definitely a lot of moves that are yet to be seen, and I wouldn't be shocked if we see some surprises along the way as well. But I do think that in order to maintain some level of stability, either the ask for Jermaine Pratt is going to be astronomically high, or you're going to see Sam Hubbard with a restructure to keep that leadership around long term. So yeah, it's going to be an interesting offseason. There are many moves that are not a question of if, but when. And there are also many moves that are, will they happen? And unfortunately, some of the big ones at the top are those questions. But time will tell what the Bengals decide to do. And like you mentioned, March 4th is a big milestone for the Bengals, and that's the deadline for them to tag T.
That day for sure, and anything leading up until then, we'll have the Bengals news here for you on Chatterbox Bengals. The Bengals released Sheldon Rankins earlier today. We're breaking it down for you. Thanks, everyone, for joining in and listening. We'll catch you next time.